Welcome back. To discuss more on China-Australia ties and the Asia-Pacific regional security landscape in the second half of the program, I'm glad to be joined by Gareth Evans, former Foreign Minister of Australia. Welcome to Dialogue, Mr. Evans.
My pleasure.
Yeah, we know this year marks the 10th anniversary of the free trade deal between China and Australia. I have some figures, like if you look at the trade volume, it had actually more than doubled during this time, and from 95, a little over 95% 10 years ago, to 214. That's an increase of more than 124%. So that says a lot about this trade relationship between the two countries.
Well, CHAFTA, the trade agreement, has been the bedrock of our economic relationship for the last 10 years, which has been developing, of course, for a much longer period. So there's a lot of confidence in Australia about the benefits from the free trade agreement, and I know that's reciprocated at the Chinese end, and I think it will be a very, very solid foundation on which to go on building in the future.
Of course, a bilateral relationship aside, there's also, it's complicated partly because of the overall, changing situation globally. For example, tariffs, and the U.S. That's the intention or intent to have U.S. allies join them against China, including trade issue. Last month, Australian Trade Minister Dan Farrell, pushed back on pressure from Washington, basically, asserting that Australia would not be joined into a U.S.-led coalition to contain China. He gave shared some facts like Australian export to China is nearly 10 times that to the United States. So this is a very important relationship to Australia, but at the same time, there's pressure from Washington. How does Australia deal with that?
Well, we're very determined to maintain our autonomy of decision-making when it comes to all the economic issues, but also the security issues as well, and we'll no doubt talk about those later on. But in the context of the trade war, this crazy trade war that Trump has initiated with everybody, friends and allies and adversaries and potential adversaries alike, even though, we have common cause with China in many, many other countries in resisting the craziness that's involved here. Whether or not that takes the form of more specific arrangements between us remains to be seen, but there's plenty of cooperative things we can do in the region and globally to advance a coherent and sensible free trade agenda. And certainly Australia has benefited very dramatically from our relationship with China. As you say, we've got a trade relationship with China which is about $80 billion surplus our way. It's a massive proportion. It's about 26% of our total trade, whereas the United States is only about 8%. So we have our own interests to advance and protect. And we have, on trade issues at the moment, very common interests with China, not with the United States.
Right, we talked about trade, with China, with the U.S. Also, we know Prime Minister Albanese is reportedly planning his second official visit to China, but that trip itself is causing some controversy inside Australia. Some people criticize him prioritizing China ties over the U.S. What's your take on that?
Oh, I don't think that's a serious criticism. I mean, there's inevitably some people in the right-wing defence and security and intelligence and media that are critical of almost anything that is not slavish devotion to the United States and demonstrates a willingness for us to chart a more independent course. That just comes with the territory in Australian politics, and I think the Albanese government is staring that down, ignoring it, making very clear the kind of relationship we want with China, recognising the huge economic benefits that flow from it, but also recognising the fact that we can live together perfectly comfortably in the security space as well. I mean, the mantra that we have been chanting is the familiar one. I mean, cooperate where we can, disagree where we must, but manage our differences wisely. That's the mindset that the Albanese government is bringing to this relationship. I think it's very well understood on the Chinese side. China doesn't expect us to walk away from the US alliance, but they do expect us to maintain our own sovereign identity and not be completely enmeshed in US decision making. And that's the course that we are going to continue to chart, and I think that Albanese will make that very clear to Xi Jinping when they meet, and it should be a very productive meeting.
Mm-hmm. What about the security side? We see the NATO summit recently in Geneva, 5% military spending, as demanded by Washington. U.S. Defense Secretary also talked about his expectation, Asian allies will do the same, including Australia, right? And also his expectation of Asian allies, to reduce your economic ties with China in case to avoid what he called like over-dependence. Will Australia do that? Is Australia, in a situation to increase that much to 5%?
We've made it very clear we'll make our own judgments about the kind of defence capability we need, bearing in mind that every country has to develop its own defence capability based not on perceived intentions of others, not making adverse judgments about the intentions of potential adversaries elsewhere, but just on the realities of power balances in the region and what you need to guard against possible contingencies in the distant future, bearing in mind that building defence capabilities are a 10, 20, 30, 40-year process. It's not something you can do overnight. So we will make our own decisions about what we need to do to build as self-reliant a defence capability as we possibly can. And we're not going to be pressured into identifying some particular arbitrary percentage. We know the world being as fragile and volatile and uncertain as it is, we know we're going to have to spend a bit more than we're spending at the moment. But we'll make that decision, and we'll make it on the basis of our judgment about the particular capabilities we need, not on the basis of some arbitrary number that is waved at us by our American friends.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, related to that is the talk of AUKUS and also the submarine issue. Where are we now?
Well, the AUKUS submarine issue is becoming more contested in Australia and more controversial, I think for three reasons. One, there are very real doubts about whether these submarines are actually ever going to be delivered from the Americans and then by the subsequent process with the British. Secondly, there's real issues about cost benefit. Even if we do get 8 of these great big beasts in 20, 30, 40 years' time, only 2 of them can be in the water at any given time, and with our vast continent and maritime surrounds, what is the real value added? Wouldn't we be better, many people are saying, in developing a larger conventional capability, conventionally powered capability, plus uncrewed underwater, in the air, vehicles, cyber capacity, missile capacity. There's all that argument. And the third argument that is resonating more and more, I think, is the argument about sovereign agency, sovereign independence. If we get ourselves enmeshed in American military decision-making to the extent that the Americans, I think, would like and perhaps expect as a result of making available this incredibly sensitive and sophisticated technology, if we get ourselves enmeshed to the extent that we can't really resist requests from the Americans to join them in any military enterprise in which they might want to engage in the future, then we will have sacrificed a lot of our sovereign independence. And that's not where most Australians, I think, want to go. And it's a real issue, and it's becoming a real issue for debate in Australia. I personally think we can spend our money much more wisely.
What about this idea of NATO expanding into Asia, having an office in Asia, strengthening relations with Asia, somehow increasing this idea like Asia and Europe are interconnected in terms of security, this kind of idea being promoted by some politicians. Do you think there's a kind of a security, worry about security in Asia?
Well, I think NATO's got enough on its hands in dealing with the issues with Russia and European defence without getting enmeshed in situations further afield. I don't think there's much of a market anywhere for formal NATO involvement, commitment, presence in the region. Yes, there will go on being relationships and military relationships between individual countries and individual members, And they will be important in technology support and supply and cooperation. But I think it's not going to contribute to stability in the East Asian region to have a visible NATO presence here on the ground. And the reality is we're going to have to find our own future in this particular region by the major players in the region recognising the advantages of a cooperative rather than a confrontational relationship, and just finding our feet again when it comes to cooperative security rather than securitizing everything and seeing everything because you're thinking in terms of hammers, everything becomes a nail that has to be beaten down. It's much more important to be focusing on diplomacy, I think, while at the same time looking after our military capability, but not being obsessed by the need for that.
Right. There's a survey done by Lawyer Institute, I think, say Australians' trust in the US has fallen to its lowest point in 20 years. With only 36% of respondents saying they trust the U.S. to act responsibly in the world. What's your take on that?
Well, that's a dramatic falling away of some 20 percentage points, I think, in just a year, and obviously it's very directly attributable to President Trump. There is no affection in Australia at all for what people perceive to be Trump's approach to international relations, Trump's approach to democracy, Trump's approach to internal respect and protection for civil liberties, for human rights. This is not a country that we've always believed in under the current administration, and it's no surprise that confidence has dropped away. I mean, nobody knows what to expect from the Trump administration when it comes to international relations. There's three different strands at work. There's the America First isolationist divisions of spheres of influence. You do your thing, we'll do ours, and we don't want to get into any confrontational mode. That's one stream. Then there's the Make America Great Again stream, which is restoring American preeminence, primacy, all that stuff, with all that follows from that in terms of willingness to use force aggressively and in breach of international rule. And then there's the purely transactional, ego-driven dimension, where there's no obvious principles that are applicable at all except personal self-interest. So this is an environment which everybody is finding rather spooky. Trump's own advisors don't know which way he's going to jump, so how can the rest of us know which way he's going to jump? So obviously there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unhappiness with the way the United States is going. Hopefully, passage of time and a number of these policy decisions that Trump has been making will come back to bite him, including the economic ones in his own constituency. So hopefully over time we'll see some modification of behaviour, but it's not surprising. But when it comes to trust, I mean, China also has some hurdles to overcome with Australia. I mean, even though the trust has been coming back from the very low point of just a few years ago, it's still only around about 20% confidence in Australian public that China will behave responsibly. But I think on the whole, the trajectory of confidence of Australians in China is going up, and the trajectory of confidence in America is going down.
Thank you, Mr. Evans.
Thank you
for speaking with us.